If you get involved in your community, if you become active in your community, you begin to attend planning board meetings, town board meetings, zoning board of appeals meetings, you may at some point hear those kinds of statements from your elected or appointed officials, or statements that are equally unreasonable. So the purpose of tonight is to help you navigate precisely what your rights are in terms of participating in your local government and gaining access to information that your government has possession of. As people who care about their community and involved in their community, those are very critical things, and we really need to understand what our rights are. Otherwise, we can't effectively advocate for ourselves, our family, our community, and our region. I have to give the disclaimer first. The program here is for informational purposes. It's not intended as legal advice. I'm not an attorney. As a matter of background, in my day job, I am a consultant, and I provide recommendations to governments and to organizations here in the U.S. and in the U.K. On regulatory compliance. So this is kind of familiar territory for me. But I think more importantly, I've been a community activist since the late 1960s, which means I'm a baby boomer. So being a baby boomer, there's always a chance that in the middle of this I will just digress and begin to talk about my bone density or something. So or have some flashback to Woodstock. So if that happens, just yell at me and say, "Bob, it's not about you," and you'll be all right. So, I do want to thank all of the sponsoring organizations. Let me go back there. There are great organizations working in this region. I feel to some degree that we are at the heart of the grassroots movement. So I encourage you, if any of these groups are working in your area, please get involved, support those groups. They're doing great work that's absolutely critical. I am a member of the board of directors for one of those groups called the Center for Sustainable Rural Communities. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, which is basically IRS speak for the fact that we survive on tax-deductible donations. Our staff, our officers are all unpaid volunteers. Our central theme is we work on programs that improve the quality of life, the livability, the sustainability of rural communities in upstate New York. Our goal is to create rural communities that have economic opportunity, access to the arts and technology, but at the same time retain their rural character. We've kind of been associated of late with the hydrofracking issue and with the pipeline fight, but that's not all we do. We work in cooperation with the State University of New York, and we offer internships for students to learn about participation in government. We provide consulting services to citizens groups and to local governments on sustainability, progressive planning techniques, and stuff like that. We're headquartered in Schoharie County in the town of Richmondville. And we offer research services. We have a facility there. We bring people in. We help them work on whatever issue they're working on. So here's the basic agenda for tonight. I want to break the program into two pieces. The first piece is talking about your right to access and participate in local government. And the second piece is your right to access information. And then we want to do a question and answer. And for me, that's really the most important part of this. I kind of want to speed to the question and answer period so we can hear about your experiences. We can walk through scenarios that you may have experienced in terms of dealing with local government and trying to get information, and kind of help you navigate that and give you some advice on what you do if you're in that situation going forward. So if you attend a lot of meetings, town board meetings, planning board meetings, at some point you're bound to run into a circumstance that just doesn't feel right. I mean, you can tell that something is amiss. Here is an actual photograph from the town board meeting. There is a resident being escorted from the meeting by the police. And not because she was shouting obscenities or throwing chairs, but because she was asking a question and insisted on asking a question that the town supervisor did not want her to ask. So here's a case where the process has failed, where that person's right to access and participate in local government has been denied. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to run into this kind of extreme situation very often, but we are going to run into it on occasion. And that's part of what we need to talk about tonight. Given that, I don't want to give the impression that we live in this massively dysfunctional area and our local government doesn't work, and we have all kinds of issues. In fact, in the state of New York, we are extremely fortunate. New York takes a lot of kicking for having all kinds of issues, but the state of New York has some wonderful, terrific regulations and laws that really are intended to give us some equality in the arena of trying to advocate for what's best for you and your community. We have two very important laws and regulations in the state of New York. The New York State Open Meetings Law and the New York State Freedom of Information Law. These are absolutely critical and they're absolutely unique. Almost no state in the United States has equal kind of regulations. This is very unusual. We have something called the New York Department of State Committee on Open Government. We are the only state in the United States that has a committee set up to protect these rights. So we are very fortunate. And those of us who live in rural communities are even more fortunate, because if you think about it, there's this kind of intimacy between us and our local government. Our elected officials are our neighbors. We live nearby. We, in some cases, have social relationships with those elected officials. The meetings are held in the evening to encourage us to participate. So we have that kind of access that's very unique. You don't see that necessarily in a suburban or urban environment. So combined with our rights and responsibilities under the laws in New York and our access, this intimacy that we have with government, we're in a good position to kind of get our position across and to advocate for what is important to us. You would think that, given that we have these two very important laws, and they're at the centerpiece of what it means to be an active citizen in the state of New York, you would think we'd have this huge infrastructure set up to interpret and enforce these laws, but in fact, we got this guy. We got one person. Robert Friedman is the executive director of the Committee on Open Government. And he's a remarkable guy. And again, we often hear a lot of criticism of elected officials or appointed officials about the bureaucracy. He's an amazing guy. He's been the lone steward of the Open Meetings Law and the Freedom of Information Law for about 25 or 30 years. It's him and one person. That's his staff. And his job is to protect all of your rights in terms of accessing local government and accessing information. Become very familiar with him. He's very responsive. If you have a question about something that has occurred at a public meeting, if you need information from your government and you're being denied that information, or you feel you're kind of being sidestepped trying to get that information, he's the guy to talk to. You call him up, you write him an email, and he'll give you a response. His basic job is to write what's called advisory opinions. So if you say to him, here's the circumstances. I went to a meeting, I raised my hand, I wanted to speak. They said, absolutely not. We're not going to allow you to speak about that particular subject. You can write him and relate it to him, and he will write an advisory opinion, which you then can take and wave in front of your town board meeting and say, hey guys, come on, you got to do this the right way. That's his sole purpose. It's very valuable. His service is very valuable, and he's very critical to all of us who want to be active in our communities. So, we're going to start talking about the Open Meetings Law, the first piece of this thing. And before we begin to talk about what we can do in a meeting, how we can get to a meeting, what we can say, what we can't say, we have to understand what a meeting is. And it's not as obvious as you might think. The law says, the Open Meetings Law says, a meeting means the official convening of a public body for the purpose of conducting public business. So there's two pieces in there we need to understand. What is a convening? When does that happen? And what is public business? The reality is that convening means that somebody calls a meeting, that it happens. Somebody in a position of authority decides we're going to have a meeting. Public business is anything that has to do with the responsibilities of that particular body. Your town board decides it's going to have a meeting and they're going to discuss town business. That's a meeting. And to some degree, that's kind of the obvious part. Everyone knows what a meeting looks like. You have your 5 town board members or your village board members sitting in the front of the room and the public is there and they're talking about official business. In terms of convening a meeting and what that really means, we really need to understand some important terms. And the first one is quorum. This is absolutely critical that we understand what a quorum is. A meeting happens anytime a quorum of your elected or appointed officials get together in a room to discuss business. And a quorum in New York State is simply a majority of the members on that board. So if you have a 5-member town board or a 5-member village board, 3 members represents a quorum. If they get together to discuss business for the town or the village, that's a meeting. And when it's a meeting, here's where it gets important to us, it's a public meeting. There is no official meeting in the state of New York that's not a public meeting. Okay? It's very important to remember. So if you have a quorum of elected or appointed officials, they get together to discuss business, you are entitled to be part of that meeting. So we know what the obvious kind of meeting is. When we have these town board meeting or village board meeting, it's scheduled the second Thursday of the month or the first Wednesday of the month. That's kind of obvious. We know when that is. But here's a scenario. There's a Little League game. Before the Little League game, people are hanging out. It happens to be 3 members of the town board there. You have the supervisor and you have 2 town board members. And they're just hanging out chatting. And then they start talking about the whether or not they should create a water district, whether or not they should extend the sewer to a rural part, water and sewer, to a rural part of the town. And they're talking about, should we have a water district? Well, quorum. I didn't mean to point to his stomach, that's kind of weird. But here's the supervisor and you have 2 town board members. Guess what? That's a quorum. And what are they doing? They're talking about town business. That's a meeting. That is a meeting. And this person over here is now attending that meeting. You'd be surprised how many decisions are made or partially made under these kinds of circumstances in rural upstate New York. And it's very important for us to understand that and kind of be vigilant when this kind of stuff happens. And sometimes you get a hint that this may be going on because you'll go to the regularly scheduled meeting and within 3 minutes of the beginning of the meeting they're voting on something. And you're thinking, when was that decision made? When was that discussion? Well, it was at the Little League game. So we have to be very careful about that. And if that happens, you need to call them on that. Diligent, responsible, elected and appointed officials would not let that happen. They would say to their colleagues, hey, let's talk about this at a town board meeting. Because when they do this, they deny you the ability to understand how decisions are being made, who's making those decisions, and how they impact you.
Are you going to take questions now or at the end?
We're going to do it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Once we hit that criteria, the threshold for a meeting, remember that is a quorum, discussing official business, it's a meeting. It doesn't matter what you call it. And you'll see town boards especially talk about workshops, working sessions, informal meetings, briefing sessions, working lunches, site visits, all of these things. It doesn't matter what you call it, it's a meeting. And if it's a meeting, you have a right to be there. Okay? And I want to give you some examples that you may not think of normally. Site visit. Planning board convenes a regularly scheduled meeting and they have a proposal before them for a large-scale development project. And it's going to be on kind of the outskirts of town in what was farmland. And there's a discussion about, well, if they do this, is it going to impact our roads? Is it going to impact the wetlands that someone knows it's there? And another planning board member says, I'm not really familiar with that area. I don't really know. And they say, why don't we go take a look? Why don't we go out and do a site visit? That's a perfectly good thing to do. It's a diligent thing for a planning board to do. But if they go to that site, and there is a quorum of the planning board members, it is a meeting. And you, as citizens and residents, have a right to be part of that site visit because it's a meeting like any other meeting. It also means they're obligated to notify you that they're going to do that. So just because it's kind of an impromptu thing, or it's a working session, or it's informal, it is nevertheless a meeting, and you have a right to be there. So under the Open Meetings Law, your rights extend fairly broadly, and that's an amazingly good thing. And I go back to the fact that we are so fortunate in the state of New York to have these kinds of rights. In a lot of cases, we don't know it, and we don't exercise them. So it's important to understand, a meeting is a meeting, and if it's a meeting, you can be there. So if it's a meeting, what has to happen? There's a whole bunch of stuff, but the important things are the public must be notified, and I'm going to talk a little bit on how that happens. Any action that's taken in a meeting requires this kind of parliamentary procedure, a normal protocol. There has to be a motion, there has to be a second, there has to be a vote. All right? Because once it becomes a meeting, all the informality goes away. There are certain obligations on the elected and appointed officials they have to follow. If it's a meeting, minutes must be taken, and they must be accurate. It does not mean that they have to be verbatim, by the way. So if someone is taking minutes, let's say it's the town clerk is taking minutes, and the town clerk wants to reflect some statements made by somebody in the room, they don't have to be literal, they don't have to be in quotation marks, but they have to be accurate. In other words, they would say something like, and there was a public discussion of, and they would list what the discussion was about. They have to be accurate, but they have to be taken. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's a site visit, a workshop, an informal meeting, whether they meet in the parking lot. If it's a meeting, somebody has to take minutes. And the reason is, so if you as a citizen don't have the opportunity to attend that meeting, you can still find out what decisions were made and by whom. It's very critical. It's kind of a cornerstone of what the democratic process is in the state of New York. If minutes are taken, if it's an official meeting and minutes are taken, those minutes need to be provided to you if you request them within 2 weeks. A common scenario is you can't attend a meeting, you go down to the town clerk's office, you say, can I have those minutes? I hear this twice a week, and the town clerk says, sorry, the minutes haven't been approved yet, they're not formal, can't have them. That's absolutely untrue. There is nothing in the law in the state of New York that says minutes need to be approved, despite what every town clerk in New York thinks. When you want the minutes, they can give you the draft minutes. The town clerk can write draft across them, whatever makes him or her happy. But in 2 weeks, you're entitled to know what happened at that meeting. And the mechanism for that is a review of the minutes. Okay, so notice, I mentioned before, if there's going to be a meeting, the public needs to be notified about it. There's a lot of misunderstanding about how that's supposed to work. And this is one of the cases where the laws in New York are not perfect. The kind of notification that's required is probably not ideal. But I'll explain it as clearly as I can and what the obligation is currently under the law. And this gets interpreted and modified, by the way. It's kind of changed a little bit over the last 10 years or so. At least 1 week prior to the meeting, and I'm going to add where possible, because there's some circumstances where this can kind of be skirted a little bit. 1 week before the meeting, the body, the official body, the town board, the planning board, has to give notice of the meeting to the local press. And it's very broadly and vaguely stated. But how it's normally interpreted is every town and village at the beginning of the year has an organizational meeting, and they decide who is the newspaper of record, for instance. They usually put it in the minutes. That's who they normally give this to, but they have to give it to the press. Now, the press doesn't have to do anything with it. The obligation for the board ends in the fact that they've given it to the press. A lot of people have the misconception that it needs to be a legal notice. There is nothing in the law that requires a legal notice. Okay? They just have to tell the press. And as kind of a backup, 72 hours before the meeting, there must be a notice posted in some conspicuous location. And that's been kind of interpreted and reinterpreted by the courts over and over again. But there is some consensus, which is when you say conspicuous, it really needs to be conspicuous. We've had cases where a town clerk will write it on a piece of paper and stick it on the wall behind her desk. Well, that's not conspicuous because you'd have to go out of your way to see it. But if the town clerk put it on, taped it onto the glass doors at the front of town hall, that's conspicuous. But there's supposed to be an attempt made to notify the public in some way. Now, recently there's been some interpretations that say that if the town has a website, whether its website is part of the county or they have their own freestanding website, they must post it on the website 72 hours in advance. It's in rural areas that may not be all that helpful. There's people who don't have high-speed internet, there's people who don't have internet access at all, but that is part of the obligation. Executive session. This is a really important part of public meetings, and I don't know how many of you have run across executive session. It is without question the most abused mechanism in the state of New York in terms of local government. Executive session is something that happens during a meeting in which the public is excluded. Your elected or appointed officials can say, we're going into executive session for the following reason. it's abused more times than not. There is a very narrowly defined criteria for executive session. Very few elected and appointed officials even understand what those criteria are. I've seen executive sessions called for erroneous reasons and seen the town attorney sit there and not correct them because the town attorney may not even fully understand what executive session criteria is about. So it's very important for people who are actively involved in their community to understand executive session and be diligent about it. And when executive session is abused, again, to call people on it. Executive session, first of all, and this is very important, is part of an open meeting. It is not some standalone kind of phenomenon that happens. So in other words, a town board can't meet on Thursday and say, okay, on Tuesday we're going to come back and go into executive session and decide X, Y, or Z. You cannot do that. An executive session must be within an open meeting. So if the town board, for instance, wants to go into executive session, they must have an open meeting, even if it's for 30 seconds. And then someone must say, I make a motion to go into executive session. It must be seconded, and they go into executive session. The reasons for going into executive session must be very specific. Okay? You will commonly hear town boards, planning boards say, we're going into executive session to discuss litigation. It's very common. Or we're going in to discuss a personnel issue. Both of those are inadequate. That is not a legitimate reason. What litigation? What personnel reason? I mean, that needs to be specified. For example, so they say we're going to go into executive session for a personnel matter. The reason they go into executive session because there is a presumption that there's a certain level of confidentiality that must be maintained, and that's reasonable. Let's suppose they need to potentially talk about taking disciplinary action against someone on the highway department. We wouldn't expect them to say, hey, we're going to go in and discuss possibly firing Joe Smith. We wouldn't expect them to do that. But what they are obligated to do under the law is saying, we're going to go into executive session to discuss potential discipline of a specific employee. They need to say that. You have a right as a citizen to know what your government is doing. They need to tell you that. If they want to talk about litigation, they can't go into executive session, by the way, because they think they might get sued. That's not litigation. We've seen board after board do this. They're dealing with a sensitive issue. They're afraid that maybe somebody's going to get really upset and file a lawsuit, so they don't want to talk about it in public. They go into executive session. That's absolutely a violation of the law. They can go in if they've been sued, if they intend to sue somebody, if they have active litigation going on, and they must say, we're going into executive session to talk about litigation with so-and-so enterprise, or this company, or this individual citizen. They have to tell you what litigation. Executive session not only is narrowly defined, it needs to stay that way. If they go into executive session to talk about a specific piece of litigation, that's what they're limited to. They can't use it as cover. It's not a case of let's call executive session and go talk in the weeds. That can't happen. They can't change the subject. They've got to come out of executive session. And responsible, diligent, elected, and appointed officials would know that and would say, okay, I make a motion, we go out of executive session because this is a public subject. It's common for a town board or planning board to go into executive session near the end of the meeting. It's just convenient. They need to tell you whether they're going to conduct business afterwards. Remember, they have to come out of executive session. So no matter how long they're in there, they have to come back into the room if they leave the room, and they have to make a motion, they have to have a vote, they come out of executive session, you're back in open meeting again. Now everyone may have gone home because it's 11:30 at night, but it's an open meeting. So they have an obligation, if you want to know, to tell you, are they going to come back and conduct any business? And if they say, no, we're not, we're going to come back, we're going to have a motion to adjourn, and we're going to go home, then you can make the decision to leave yourself. But they need to tell you. You need to know. We've seen town boards go into executive session and come back at 11 o'clock and make all kinds of important decisions because they know no one's in the room. So Again, you need to know. Ask them the question. If they make a motion to go into executive session, stand up, say point of order, or are you coming back after executive session and conducting business? You have a right to do that. And by the way, I should tell everybody, anybody who wants this presentation, because there's a lot of citations in there, there's a lot of references, I can email it to you. And here's a couple that I threw in here just in case you want it. So if you come up afterwards and just give me your email, I'll mail you the presentation. Okay, here's something very interesting. I mentioned before that minutes have to be taken at any open meeting. If a board goes into executive session and they make a decision of any kind, they have a motion, they vote. So there's a decision being made. Minutes need to be taken, even in an executive session. And here's kind of a catch-22 from their perspective. If minutes are taken, they're foilable. You can ask for those minutes under the Freedom of Information Law. Now, because of the fact that they are going into executive session to maintain some kind of confidentiality, they have a right to kind of limit what they're giving you. But you can see those minutes. They may be redacted, they may be partially crossed out, but at least you get a sense of what decision was made in executive session. Very few people understand that you can reach into executive session to a certain degree and find out what is happening. This is the most frustrating thing for a lot of people. People always ask this. They won't let me speak. I can't make comments. Well, unfortunately, in the state of New York, we have no right to make comments or ask questions at a public meeting. As frustrating as that is the reality. We don't. There is no right to do that. What we do have is something called privilege of the floor, and the name implies it is a privilege. It's granted. So any board can say, okay, we're going to allow public comment. We're going to grant privilege of the floor. If they don't, they don't, and you don't have a right to speak. But I would encourage you that if you're in a community where routinely you're denied the right to comment or ask questions, I would apply every imaginable political pressure you can on that board, because they are not acting in a way that's consistent with the principles of democracy. Everybody knows, you can feel it. You know that you should have the right to comment and to ask questions. And if they're not allowing you to do that routinely, it's because they don't want to hear what you have to say. And therefore, they're not good elected or appointed officials, and you need to take some action. Can you sue them for that? Probably not. Do you have any leverage legally? Probably not. Maybe in some very limited circumstances. But it's critical that you still lobby for your right to speak. In terms of privilege of the floor, though, and this is important to understand, if they grant privilege of the floor, they cannot be selective about privilege of the floor. When they open the door, and it's time for you to walk through. If they say, and I've seen this happen, for instance, they say, we're not going to have privilege of the floor. And they're talking about a subject, and it's about a development that's going to happen in town. And they look over and they see somebody from the development company, and they say, Joe, what are you guys going to do about that thing down there? And Joe stands up and says, well, we're going to do this. Guess what? They just opened the door. That person is a member of the public. So if the member of the public is granted the right to speak, it's privilege of the floor. At which point you stand up and say, point of order, I'd like to speak. You've opened privilege of the floor. And I'm on the floor. So it's very important to understand that. Now, we often see a lot of restrictions applied to privilege of the floor. And I made the kind of sarcastic comment at the beginning that only residents of Meredith would be allowed to speak. I hear elected and appointed officials say something similar to that all the time. It's illegal. Period. It's illegal. You cannot do that. You cannot say, we're restricting this to residents of our town. Privilege of the floor means the right of the public to speak. And it doesn't matter if you're from France, you're a member of the public, and you have a right to speak at any official meeting in the state of New York. Certain individuals can't be prevented from speaking. I've seen this too. You can't speak because you go on, or we don't like what you have to say, or you keep talking about the same issue. They can't do that either. A member of the public has the right to speak. The last one gets a little dicey. This issue of having a prohibition on a particular topic. You would think that this one would be against the Open Meetings Law, but unfortunately it's not. Bodies in the state of New York, town boards, planning boards, can vote to eliminate or prohibit the discussion on a particular topic. As counterintuitive as that seems and unfair as it seems, they have a right to do that. But it can't be this kind of unilateral ad hoc decision. So in other words, and we've seen this a lot too, the mayor will say in a village meeting, or the town supervisor will say in a town meeting, I'm sorry, I'm not taking questions on that subject. He or she cannot do that. But someone on the board can say, I make a motion that we prohibit discussion of X. And then there's a vote in the majority. They can do that. They can define the terms for privilege of the floor. However, what we've seen is a new attack. In the last week and a half or so, you may be familiar with this, in the town of Sanford, they prohibited discussion on fracking. Well, guess what? They're getting sued. They're getting sued on the principle that is a violation of the New York State Constitution and the United States Constitution. And we'll see where that goes. And I think the argument basically is that it's an extreme case. It has to deal with a subject of extreme interest to the community. Therefore, you're stifling public comment unnecessarily and you're violating constitutional rights. But generally speaking, they can say, you know, we're not going to talk about that housing development. We're not going to talk about the fact that we're closing down the senior housing. They can do that. Again, your recourse is, in most cases, political pressure. Because, you know, obviously that doesn't contribute to good democratic process. You need to call them on it. You know, you need to make as many people in the public aware of the fact that comment and questions are being stifled. Relatively new change to the open meetings law. This is very common. You go to a meeting, they're having a public hearing. They're going to adopt a change to the zoning. And everybody's sitting up at the table, rifling through the new zoning regulation, and you're expected to comment from the public, or you're given the opportunity, but you don't have a copy of that law. And this used to be very common. So you had to kind of guess at what they were doing. There's been a recent update to the open meetings law that says that they have to provide you reasonable access to those kinds of documents. So if it's being discussed at a public meeting and you request the documents that are going to be discussed, you can request them in advance and they have to give them to you. So you're prepared for that public comment period. And you can make intelligent comments and contribute to the process. Again, if the town or whoever it is that's this body, the county, has a website, they're required to post that information in advance of the meeting so you can kind of prep yourself. You can be prepared. It's supposed to be out there. A lot of towns in particular have still not caught up to this fact. They haven't kind of internalized the fact that this is their obligation, but it is their obligation under the open meetings law. So let me move to the Freedom of Information Law, the second important piece of what our rights are in terms of advocating for our communities. The general principle is that government in the state of New York will be open. That truly is the principle, and it's codified in the law. And it says that we should have reasonable access to information that the government has. And you'd be surprised at how broad this is really defined. It talks about our right to get to records. And records, again, are very broadly defined. They're almost anything that's in possession of the government we should have access to. And I've kind of done like a shorthand version of some of the things that are important probably to you as well as to me, or could be, that we have access to. Minutes, letters, memos, emails, recordings, contracts, proposals, files, even entire databases. This is hard to believe, but we have said, this is so cool to me. We as citizens have the right to say, you're maintaining a database on, I don't know, all of the wetlands in the state of New York. And you've added to that database all kinds of critical information like, oh, I don't know, what would happen if a pipeline went through those wetlands, for instance. We have a right to go to that agency and say, I want a copy of your entire database. I want it on some removable media because I'm going to run it on my server farm. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, and guess what? They have to give it to you. Because it's a record maintained by your government, and you as a resident and a citizen of New York have a right to get to that information. It's a really powerful right that we have. And it's important to know we have it, and it's important to exercise it when we need to. Policies, procedures, documents, correspondence, all of the usual stuff. Telephone records. I don't know, maybe you have some concern that maybe your town supervisor has been having ex parte discussions with a fracking company, for instance. Ask for the telephone records. I mean, he may be smart enough to use his own cell phone, and it's not controlled by the town, but take a shot at it. You'll never know, you never know. When you ask for information, by the way, I think I may even have a slide like this. All right, let me do this one first. So how do you ask for information under Freedom of Information? It's very simple. You just request it. You write a letter, you send an email. If your town, every town has a person called the custodian of record. It's normally the town clerk. If your town clerk has access to email, you have a right to request FOIL information via email. And don't be told that you can't, because you can't. You might walk into a town office and they'll say, oh, you want FOIL records? Here, you must fill out this form. You don't have to fill out any form. All you have to do is write it down and tell them what you want. All right? It's not, requesting documents under FOIL is not on their terms, it's on your terms, because the law is designed to protect you. All you need to do is ask. They may ask you why you want them. It's none of their business. They may ask you who you're affiliated with. Are you with that group? It's none of their business. Okay? You don't have to tell them. You don't have to say anything other than, this is what I want. And their obligation is to say, you know, with the old expression of jump how high. They have to tell you when. They have 7 days to respond to you, to tell you when they're going to give you records. Now, be very careful about this. They don't have to give you the record in 7 days. But in 7 days, they have to tell you when they're going to deliver the record. And the law makes an assumption that whatever they say has to be reasonable. So if you say to them, I need a one-page document, and they say, it's going to take 4 months, obviously you call Robert Freeman and you say, you know, I'm getting the runaround, because that's not reasonable. If you ask for the entire database of the Department of Transportation, they might say it'll take a year, and that might be reasonable. But use your good judgment in terms of what the response is. But you need a response in 7 days. They have to tell you. Not 7 business days, 7 days. Can they refuse to provide a record? Yes, they can. But there are very narrowly defined criteria, again, for denying you a record. And if you go on the website, Committee on Open Government, the law is right there. It spells out exactly why they can refuse to give you information. It has to do usually with things that have to do with confidentiality. It may be criminal record stuff. But they can deny you certain records. They can partially deny you certain records. They can cross stuff out. But when they do that, they have to tell you why. They can't just, if you request 4 documents and you get 3, you're not supposed to guess. They have to tell you why they denied to give you the 4th document. Or if they cross stuff out, they have to tell you why they're crossing it out. It violates confidentiality, it's national security, they have to tell you something. So you have a right to know. Here's some examples of the kind of things that they can hold back and not give you. If they're an unwarranted violation of privacy. For instance, there may be a disciplinary record for an employee in a town. And that disciplinary record may refer to the fact that the person had emotional issues or is being treated for mental illness or something like that. Obviously that's, you know, confidential medical related information. You wouldn't expect that to go out to the public. So they can kind of redact that kind of information. It can't jeopardize collective bargaining or contract awards, and be very careful with this because a lot of town attorneys love this one. If they can relate it in any way to collective bargaining or to contract, they'll deny giving you the FOIL request. But the law says it has to be jeopardizing that. So in other words, if they're about to make an offer to the union that represents town employees, and that's going to happen in the next week, they can probably hold back the document. But to give you a record of something they discussed with a labor union 5 years ago is not covered by this. So you need to make them specify precisely why this is relevant. Would deny someone the opportunity for a fair trial, it would endanger life, this is kind of obvious stuff, or interfere with a criminal investigation. You get a lot of redaction, a lot of denials if you FOIL stuff from a police agency, for instance. And in most cases, there's a pretty good reason why that they wouldn't give you that information. But normal business that we are concerned about as community activists it's very difficult for them to withhold that information because it typically is very public kind of information and it's very relevant to the kinds of decision makings we're concerned about. Be very skeptical if you're denied. If you're denied, they must tell you that not only are we denying it, but you have a right to appeal, and you need to appeal. If you're denied an access to records that you requested under FOIL, file an appeal. Now you file it with the same person, and it may seem like kind of a waste of time, but it's not, because you've really established how serious you are about it, and you've set the foundation for taking further action. But if you really need that information, or you want that information, file the appeal. And that, by the way, that's as simple as just saying, I hereby appeal the denial of my FOIL. No special form, you don't need an attorney. So, freedom of information law, open meetings law, two absolutely critical things that are, give us immense power as residents and citizens in the state of New York. Really give us an opportunity to leverage change, to understand how decisions are made, who are making those decisions, which sometimes is even more important than anything else. So when we begin to think politically, we know who it is that's not being responsive to our concerns and our needs. Those two laws give us immense power in kind of informing ourselves and making decisions about what we're going to go and do going forward as residents and citizens. So I'd like to hear any questions you might have, kind of experiences you have. Yes, right there.
I wanted to ask, who's the committee that Robert is the director of?
It's
Is
him.
there a committee?
It's him as assistant and a secretary.
So there is
It's
no
him.
committee?
There's no committee. He's the committee. Yeah,
Okay,
he really is. Yeah. And by the way, a couple years ago, they tried to cut his budget in half, which I thought was just insane. I actually wrote letters to the governor saying, "Are you kidding?" I mean, there's one guy. He is a remarkable guy, and he gets it done. If, by the way, you ask him for an advisory opinion, right now, it could take you months to get that advisory opinion because there's only so much he can do. But if you call his office and say, I have a critical situation, you know, this is really affecting the community, sometimes he can be pretty responsive, and he'll give you kind of an informal response, kind of a preliminary response, and that can be all you need, potentially. Yes, fine.
What happens beyond Robert? Where does he go should he not be able to fulfill your answer and you've had some, you know, traffic of communication back and forth? Does he have a step beyond that where he goes for this?
That's a really good question. Yeah. Essentially what you're asking for is how do you escalate, what's the enforcement of this thing?
Correct.
And remember, he only issues advisory opinions. This is kind of a self-enforced kind of regulation. As important as it is, it falls on you to do something if they're not doing what they're supposed to. So you become armed with his advisory opinion. It says that they did not follow the law. You then have to pursue it with litigation. An Article 78 lawsuit, for instance, against the town. But there isn't an agency that enforces this, unfortunately. It's not like you can then turn to your local district attorney and say, hey, you need to fix this for me, because that's not how it works, unfortunately. The burden falls on you. And in a lot of cases where we need to really force our local government or even our state government to do something, and we have to file that kind of challenge, the burden is on us not only to do it logistically, but financially as well. I mean, you realistically in the state of New York can't file an Article 78 for less than maybe $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. So again, this is imperfect. Yes?
I just want to ask a question. Our town board had a meeting with the Constitution Pipeline people. Now, should that have been a public meeting?
How many were there? Was it a quorum?
As far as I know, they were all there.
Yes.
And so they said, no, it was a closed meeting.
There is no closed meetings in the state of New York.
Okay, and so there should be minutes available
Yes.
to the
Yes.
general public. So
And-
what they say, there's none.
I would get all of that information and send it to Robert Freeman and ask him for an advisory opinion.
Okay.
And then I would take the advisory opinion and hand it to the town attorney and to the town board and say, what are you going to do about this? I mean, that's really what you need to do.
And the second part of that question is I requested twice verbally to get a copy of the audit for the last year, and they said that it wasn't available because the people who come and do the audit had to go someplace else.
Okay, and they took all the paper with them?
I don't know what's the requirement
Yeah.
for when their audit is, what their fiscal year is, and it's like,
If an audit is conducted, there's a report, and the report becomes a record.
it's a public record.
It's a public record,
Right.
and you have a right to gain access to it.
Okay.
I would put it in writing, say I'm requesting this under the provisions of the Freedom of Information Law, and then they're obligated to give it to you.
All right, so two things I would have to request. The minutes from their private meeting with the Constitution Pipeline. And
Yes.
the audit.
Right. Now, remember, if they didn't take minutes, that's a violation. So that alone, Robert Freeman can issue an advisory opinion at, he can kind of scold them for. The fact that they didn't open the meeting to the public, he can scold them on. The fact that they didn't announce it to the public, he can scold them on. So all of those things should be reported to him. Yes? Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Going back to the executive session, when they have to hold on, like say you were saying that they don't want to have to say something and they have to hold like a bit of a vote right there. Does that mean that everybody has to say their yay or nay? Or is it like, oh, well, we don't feel like talking about this. You guys agree we don't feel like talking about this? Or
You mean
is it
in order to go
coerced, or is it-
into
yeah.
executive session?
No, in order to, just any question, like in order for them to, as you were actually, not even in an executive session, actually, when you want to ask something about something and they don't want to talk about it.
Okay,
Yeah,
right,
do they
okay.
have
So
to-
they've allowed you to speak and ask a question. You ask a question and they don't want to talk about that particular subject. They must say, yes, do we want to restrict this discussion? Do we want to prevent that discussion? They must have a motion, a second, and a vote, a majority vote. Otherwise, they gotta at least let you ask the question. They don't have to answer, by the way. There's no obligation under the law that they have to act like decent human beings and actually respond to your question. You can say, hey, how come you allowed this to happen? And they can stare at you and never respond. There's no obligation. And believe me, that's a tactic that some elected officials use. So, but if they're going to prevent you from asking the question or making a comment on it, they must vote. Yes. Yes, sir.
The privilege of the floor, can that be restricted to, for example, a half hour?
Yes.
And can they restrict each individual's time period? And if, for example, to say you're allowed to speak but only for 3 minutes?
Yes.
And then if the half hour is over, the next one online is then told, sorry, the half hour is over, we don't have time for you. So
That's
they do
all,
restrict.
yes, they can.
They do.
But there is some case law that suggests that at some point that becomes onerous. For instance, if they said we're going to have privilege of the floor and everyone has 3 seconds to ask a question, I think at some point you'd be able to get some judicial relief. You'd be able to go to a judge and say, come on, this is crazy. That's just an attempt to squelch public comment, to freedom of speech, that kind of thing. But yes, they can control it. And the argument that they use is, you know, we have limited time and we have to conduct business. So yeah, unfortunately.
And just as a follow-up question, when we have town board members making a visit to Pennsylvania to observe the tragedies down there, is that a public meeting if all 5 of them in the car
Yes.
together? And is it a public meeting once they go over the border into Pennsylvania?
That's a really good question. You know, I'll give you my gut answer is yes, they're still conducting business. There's nothing, if you look at the open meetings law, there's nothing that says as long as the meeting's within the local jurisdiction. There's no such language there. So, you know, unless it's been interpreted by the courts elsewhere to mean outside of the jurisdiction, it doesn't apply. But I would say, yeah. I mean, and here's the position I always take as kind of an activist, which is I always make the argument that I believe is the right argument and let them defend it. You know, if there's some gray area in there, make it their responsibility to clarify the gray area. Go for it. That's what I always say. Make the argument. File a complaint.
So it would be better if we were organizing a trip there to put 2 in a car rather than all 5 together.
Well, when they get there, they're still going to discuss it, I'm assuming. So it's at some point it's going to be a public meeting unless they split up.
Right.
You know, so I actually had a planning board one time make a site visit, and they said we're not going to make it a public meeting because we're not going to speak to each other. And sure enough, I went and I said I got to see this. And for an hour and 20 minutes, they all walked around going. And they didn't speak. I don't know how they did it. But I said, you guys win. You're right. It wasn't a public meeting. You didn't accomplish anything, but it wasn't a public meeting. So.
Sorry, this might sound kind of stupid, but would speaking in different languages or sign or with hand-arm signals, would that consider them still speaking to each other?
That's pretty funny, but I like it.
It's true, you know?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I want you to talk a little more about the documents being provided in advance.
Yes,
Our town board doesn't issue an agenda in advance, you can pick it up at the time of the meeting.
right.
They sometimes put out a document that has something to do with one of the agenda items at the time of the meeting. How would you get documents in
Right.
advance since you don't have any idea what they're going to talk about?
Again, it's a really good question. There is no requirement that a public body issue an agenda, okay? Agendas are not a requirement, they're kind of just a convenience. I think when it really matters is when when public comment is really important, like a public hearing. There's something called a public hearing, which is, the purpose is to get your comment. In that case, if they're going to have a public hearing, they put a notice in the paper, and you know it's going to happen, and they have to list the reason for the public hearing. At which point, again, this obligation kicks in, where they also then need to make these documents available on the website or whatever. But if it's just a regular meeting, and they somehow know they're going to talk about something. Let's say they got a bid for a new plow truck, for instance. They're supposed to at the very least, have a pile of those things on the table, and they're going to start talking about it. You're going to say, excuse me, point of order, I'd like to see the document. They're supposed to say, here's the document. Go ahead, you can review it. Not that that's going to give you a great deal of time, but at least needs to be available. So whenever you know that they're going to discuss about, however you find out, you have a right to ask for a copy of the document.
I have a follow-up on that about websites.
Yeah.
A community group that I'm co-founder of maintains a website. And we have offered both the town and the village a chance to use our website for, we wouldn't edit it, we would let them use it,
Right.
give them a page, put anything on it they want. Would they be allowed to do that? Is there any reason why they can't do it?
There's no reason why they can't do that. If they declare, particularly at the organizational meeting at the beginning of the year, this is going to be our internet outlet. If they do that, sure, why not? I don't think there's any prohibition.
They're just silent about it. They haven't responded at all.
Right, right.
And I'm not actually expecting that they will.
Well, I don't want to be overly cynical because, you know, that gets dangerous. But there's, in some communities, particularly rural communities, there is a reluctance to embrace technology because, not only because some elected and appointed officials are intimidated by it and don't feel comfortable, but because I think they intuitively know the more information the people in that room have and are staring at me at the meeting, the harder questions they're going to ask me. So there is a reluctance to put a lot of information out because you're going to utilize it to ask questions. I live in Schoharie County. We have a board of supervisors. There's 16 members. One of them has a published email address. This is crazy. This is the 21st century. But they've made a decision not to do that because they don't want to get emails. They don't want that kind of exchange. They want to avoid that kind of information exchange that they think in some way works to their disadvantage. And that's the cynical answer, but I believe it to be true.
The only answer to that is public pressure.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, actually, in about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we asked our town to have we made a formal request at a meeting for them to have a website. And we told them it was not expensive, that we could probably find people in the community that would help pay for it, or we do it for nothing. We talked about the one that they have in Meredith, and he refused. He said, we cannot afford to do it. And I said, but maybe we could give us nothing. He said, we cannot afford to do it. And that was the only thing that he would answer, the supervisor.
Right.
Now, we have a website with a local community called Franklin Local. We have a website. If I go to them and say, we would like you to post your business on our website, would they be obliged to do it? Or
No,
could
I don't think they'd be obliged to do it. No.
Or what about putting their agendas there? What about doing all the things that people are supposed to know ahead of time?
I think in that case, you know, you can do it, but I don't think you kind of engage the obligation on their part to continue to do it. I don't think so. Because that's really not their formal outlet. You know, it's not something that, you know, they can contend they don't have control over it. They can contend they didn't authorize it. But once they authorize an outlet, then they're obligated to post appropriate stuff there. So, you can't force them to do the right thing, you know, if it's not specified in the law. And there's nothing in the law that says you must have a website. It just says if you have one, that's someplace where you need to post information. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about the agenda to follow up. Our supervisor used to put it out, and we could have access to it usually a day or two ahead of time. Now, I think because he doesn't want us to know what's going on ahead of time, we're not getting it.
Right.
If 3 of the board members say, we want to have an agenda that's available to the public, can they do that and can
Sure.
that be enforced?
Yes, yes. There's an important thing to remember, you know, a lot of times we kind of get intimidated by the process. You go to a town board meeting, and you see this a lot, particularly if you have one person on that board, whether it be the supervisor or it's the mayor, has a very strong personality. There's an assumption that he or she has to go along with it for it to happen. But you remember how government works in the state of New York. It's a majority vote. The supervisor has 1 vote. The mayor has 1 vote. So whenever you're trying to get anything done, think about, I need 3 votes. That's all you really need. You don't have to change somebody's mind that you're not going to be able to change. So you're absolutely right. If you want to get an agenda as a normal process and protocol, get 3 people to vote for it. And then they're obligated to do it. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
In our town, our supervisor gives privilege of the floor to an individual, and that person speaks. And I thought that that's what that meant. You're saying that I should say, point of order, I
Yes.
would like to speak since you've opened this, since you've opened up privilege of the floor?
Yes, absolutely.
And do I have to talk about what he talked about, or can I can
Anything.
change the subject?
You can ask him why the price of
Yes.
bananas is so high. Yes. Now, here's something else very important to remember. Suppose he responds to you, I'm sorry, that's not how privilege of the floor works here. Then your answer is, okay, show me the minutes of the meeting in which there was a vote taken to establish the criteria for privilege of the floor. He can't make it up as he goes. At some point they had a vote to say, privilege of the floor means we're going to allow privilege of the floor for 1 person. If he can't produce that, and I guarantee he can't, then you kind of have it. Yes?
Now, you said that the public does not have the right to comment, but privilege of the floor may be granted?
Yes.
Can you clarify that for me, please?
It simply is, they don't have to allow public comment at all at a meeting. Privilege of the floor means they're granting you the right to speak, not because they have to, but because they want to. That's really what it translates to be. And it is normal procedure for a government body to allow public comment, the theory being they need to inform themselves about what their constituents want. So they do it. It's reasonable. But they don't have to. I know town boards, I know village boards that haven't had privilege of the floor in 2 years.
Can it vary from meeting to meeting, or?
No, the conditions for privilege of the floor have to be pre-established by a vote. Now, they can establish, they can sit down one day and say, okay, we're going to decide what the conditions are for privilege of the floor. And they can say by a majority vote, we're going to give the authority to make the decision on an individual basis to the mayor or to the supervisor. They can do that. But the authority has to be granted by a majority of the board. So there has to be some formal vote to do that. But again, it can't be they just make it up each meeting depending on what mood they're in or depending on what they know the public wants to talk about that day, which is usually what happens.
In my town, it has come to my attention, because we have a little group and we've begun sending out emails reminding people about when the meetings are and because of all this gas drilling issue. I had an individual write back to me and explain that she was very upset because she sends a lengthy, which she forwarded to me also, very well thought out, well written letter asking several questions of the supervisor and the town officials. She told me that she was very upset because no one has ever responded to her and it's not in the minutes, and she mailed it right from our town post office, so she knew who got there, etc. So I have been sort of holding that in my pocket and wondering, you know, is this something that's going to be sort of useful for us in some way? Is that something I can write to this fellow with and try to bring back to them?
Well, I think your issue in terms of Robert Freeman might be as narrow as there's an issue in how the minutes were taken. Here's the thing. You can issue correspondence to your elected officials. They have to acknowledge it as correspondence, and correspondence should be reflected in the minutes, but they don't have to answer it. There's no obligation to respond.
And what about, I'm sorry, what about, do they have an obligation to read those at the meetings when they receive correspondence from the
No.
public?
No.
Okay.
They have to acknowledge that it was done. A lot of boards will read them, but a lot of boards won't, particularly if they have 20 pieces of correspondence.
Okay,
They're not
do they
gonna
have
do
to
it.
acknowledge receiving correspondence and what it was related to? Like, we got a letter from Mrs. Smith and it's regarding to questions about hydrofracking.
No, actually, all they have to do is acknowledge that they have correspondence.
Okay,
you
so
know.
they did not do that,
Right.
and so they, all right,
Yeah.
that was.
But that really isn't your central issue. The central issue is you really want them to respond to your concerns, and
Yeah,
that's
and it's-
outside the scope of this,
Right, and
unfortunately.
it's, the woman is clearly very upset, and her tone of her email saying how aggravated she was about not
So
getting
the
response.
the follow-up should be, if she can get privilege of the floor, is to stand up and say, I wrote this correspondence, it was sincerely issued, I would like a response. I mean, she has a right to do that. She still may not get one, but she
Can
may.
anyone speak on her behalf, because we have a
Sure.
lot of very timid individuals,
Absolutely.
of which
Yeah.
I am not one.
Remember, you can, privilege of the floor means you can talk about anything you want, unless they have voted on a prohibition on that topic. Yes, ma'am.
Couple of things. So one of the biggest frustrations I have with, in my town board, where I serve, but are the minutes do not really reflect what happened at the
Right.
meeting.
Right.
And we've gone around and around about it, you know, because, I mean, the town clerk will issue minutes of the meeting, and I'll, you know, and she'll send them out by email, and I'll then supplement it so that if anyone who missed the town board meeting, that is of the elected officials, will at least know that we also talked about fracking or some other topic, or you know, talked about something that's relevant.
When you supplement them, can you get the other members of your town board to accept them as a modification of the minutes? Do you formally alter the
Well, I
minutes?
haven't tried that. See, what I tried, and initially, I mean, I laid out all the reasons why it made sense to have more detailed town minutes.
Right.
I'm old, I'm forgetful, I don't necessarily remember what we talked about. It would be nice to see someone taking notes about that, because that's not my responsibility during the meeting. Or just that it's helpful for people to know what we talk about. And for a while, she gave in a little bit, and then she came back to me, she'd met with other town clerks, and she couldn't state any kind of opinions, couldn't report on somebody having an opinion, because they could get sued.
Yeah, that's not true.
I mean, I know that's not true,
But remember,
so it's just like a struggle, and I don't know that open meetings law helps in any way, but I'm bringing it up.
it helps in the regard that the open meetings law said the minutes must be taken and they must be accurate. If you can substantiate that significant pieces of what occurred are not being reported, then it's a violation. They're inaccurate.
Okay.
Now, again, it doesn't have to be verbatim, and he or she can leave
no.
out the nuance.
No.
But if there is a conversation that happened that's critical to the town, and it's neglected to be reported, that's a violation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just one other thing. I've been using the Freedom of Information law to get information from the DEC. And that's something you've been more focused on meetings. For example, the DEC's, you can, if you monitor their website or their environmental notice bulletin, you will find when companies file applications for gas wells. And you can foil the well application, which tells you a great deal of information that your town government doesn't know even. And you can be way ahead of the ball on that. If you ask for those applications, you get the information. For example, one of the things we're discovering and learning in Shenango County and neighboring town of Sanford, all of the well applications that have been filed for high-volume hydrofracking, just waiting for an SGIS to be promulgated so they can start issuing permits even before we have regulations. And those give truck route maps for hauling water and how many trips it's going to be and how many gallons and how large that unit is and who's going to get compulsory integrated and all that. And so those FOIL requests can be very useful for people And I just wanted to, bring
Yeah.
that up so people
Well,
think
that's
about
important.
other ways to use FOIL.
Right, and FOIL applies to any government body, right? And that includes, by the way, your school board, for instance, which is an elected body. You can FOIL it. The open meetings law applies to school boards. People don't always think in those terms. But all the way up to the state level. And by the way, and this is kind of outside the scope, but you can go to federal agencies with a similar law called FOIA, F-O-I-A, and request information of a federal agency. I can tell you that it's an arduous process and it takes a long time to get a response and it's always going to be redacted. But you can take a shot at it and sometimes you get lucky. The press is very good at this. And again, thank God we have these things because that reinforces a free and open press in this country, that the press can ask for information and get it ultimately. So let me just go to the back.
Yes, I would just like to know, as you can see, there are a lot of people here, and due to the naivete of our boards, we're all interested practically in the same vein of the drilling, the fracking, the pipeline, etc. I'm just interested to know where everybody is coming from, what towns. Could you take a poll and just see, like, we're from Otsego. Evidently somebody up in front is from Franklin. I'd just like to know, basically geographically, where we're all located, that we all are coming up with the same problems.
Would it be helpful to know by county, or are we assuming most people here are from
Well, if somebody
Delaware?
wants to say I'm from Morris, or I'm from Oneonta, I would appreciate that.
Anybody want just a quick comment on where you're from? Just to give
So
us
why
a
don't we
sense.
have Delaware County towns start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm Meredith, and we have a great town board.
Everybody from Meredith.
Yay.
Okay.
Good, you're the only people who can speak.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't do that.
Town of Davenport.
Davenport.
Who else is from Davenport?
We got Franklin and Andes and Sydney,
In Walton.
Walton.
Trout Creek.
Oneonta?
That's not
So
a
That's
that's
somebody from
Otsego.
Lawrence.
Otsego County.
Lawrence.
The three of us are from Andes.
And we just banned fracking.
Gene, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I'll be right back to you.
About halfway through, you had a slide up there and you said you were talking about privilege of the floor. The door is open. Once the door is open, walk on through and let it rip. How does that door close, or does that door close? Ken touched on limiting privilege of the floor with a vote.
It normally closes based on time constraints, and the board will say, you know, we're going to allow privilege of the floor for the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes, or we're going to allow people 3 or 4 minutes each to speak. It's usually that simple, really. They've hopefully defined that someplace formally as to what the criteria is going to be, and that's how it closes. Gene.
Does precedent play any role here? For example, our town board, I mean, none of them, they all need to be replaced, but when meetings are conducted, they're very, at least superficially, very open. If they're having a discussion about a particular issue, any one of us in the audience can raise our hands and join in and ask questions, and the questions are appreciated and responded to. I don't know if it gets to a question of a ban on fracking, for which there's no possibility now, so that nothing would happen. But I mean, if there were a discussion among them, I don't know if they'd welcome that kind of interference. But my point is, since that precedent is established in Franklin of people just joining in and people actually in the audience, among citizens volunteering to go do research on something and bringing it back to the board, you know, like recently there was a discussion of a Time Warner cable franchise, and none of the board members bothered to review the agreement, but one of the town residents did, and he came in with all the questions, and they tabled the thing because of his questions. And so, once this precedent has been established, is there any leverage there?
I mean, they could change how they do it at the next meeting, but again, it has to be kind of formally adopted. They're going to have a vote. I think they've established that this is the criteria they normally use, and it's particularly if it's been over a period of time. So if they suddenly walk in and say, that's it, no more privilege of the floor, you know, they're going to have to go through some meaningful process to establish that it's changed. And a lot of towns, by the way, have kind of that informal thing where privilege of floor is ongoing. It's just whenever you have a question. And, you know, that works. In some cases, it works.
So I remember when they say, we'll briefly talk about fracking, briefly touch the subject.
If they've established that that's the criteria, sure,
Only
they
for
can do
fracking
that.
though, but the rest then can be open.
Well,
They did that.
you might have an argument there, but again, I think your first step is to ask him, what is your criteria? What have you established for privilege of the floor? And how have you done that? And unless they can produce something that says, on this day, we voted to do X, Y, and Z, and limit hydrofracking discussions, then they're making it up as they go, and they're not supposed to do that.
We had one board member walk out. One of the questions was, I'm leaving, right?
Well, he or she can do that. Again, they don't have to be polite, they don't have to listen, and they don't have to respond. There's no obligation. I mean, yeah. I'm sorry, you
Thank
go
you.
first.
I think I know the answer, but I just want to hear it from you. We have the right to use any recording device or camera at a meeting, and they can't stop us from doing it.
Absolutely. The only limitation is you can't be disruptive. So in other words, you can't stand in front of the board and block the view, or you can't stand there and be making all kinds of noises, changing your tapes. They have a right to say you're being disruptive. But in the state of New York, you can record in any way you want. Audio recordings, video recordings, still photography, absolutely that is your right. Yes.
I'm sorry, touching on what he said, when somebody can get up and walk out, a board member, they can get up and leave. Does that in fact make them not like, all right, well, you're out, so you're done for this session, you can't say anything about it no more? Like, or, he can't come back in after the question is asked because he didn't want to hear it and say, okay, well, I vote nay for this, you know?
No, he can come back. It would have to be reflected in the minutes that he was absent during a certain period. That's supposed to be reflected. But there's nothing to prevent that person from walking back in and no longer being absent. I mean, that person was a legitimate elected official. So if the meeting goes 3 hours and that person is missing for an hour, it doesn't mean they can't come back at the end of the meeting and vote. There's no reason they couldn't.
Even if it was on the same subject of what was just talked about.
Yeah, well, I think what you're getting at is, do they have a right to participate if they're not well informed? And the answer is, yes, they can be as stupid as they want.
If 3 of them walked out, does that change the quorum?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
I have another question.
Oh, and remember, quorum is, and this is an interesting distinction. You have a 5-person board and there's a vacancy, okay? The quorum is still 3. It's how many people are supposed to be on the board. How is the board defined? Not a quorum of who is currently on the board. It's a quorum is the majority of the people, how the board is configured. So if it's 3 is 3. It doesn't matter whether there's 2 vacancies, whatever. I mean, I've seen boards where they have vacancies and somebody doesn't come in and you can't conduct business because there is no quorum. You just can't do it. Yes, sir. Right here.
If a board member walks out of the meeting before a moratorium vote, and the vote is 3-1, is that a supermajority?
No. It's of how the board is configured, not who's present. A supermajority would be 4.
He just walked out to avoid being part of the vote. He was there and he left.
He didn't vote, that's all. He's, abstained, missing, absent.
But that's not a ploy? That's not considered a ploy?
Oh, it could be all kinds of stuff, but...
No vote can be considered a vote in various circumstances.
Yeah, it's essentially a vote. I mean, the person has given up the right to vote and changed the,
But that required a supermajority.
What requires a
Well,
supermajority?
he was a supermajority vote and the fellow walked out, right?
The problem is
For the moratorium.
that the 3-1 or 3-2 vote's going to go back to Delaware County Planning Board, and they're going to say, we need a supermajority. I mean, this was hoping 3-1 was a supermajority, and it didn't take 4 to 1.
Right. Well, supermajority is required under certain circumstances. That's the fine. That doesn't, again, they can't just make that up. A supermajority happens. In a lot of cases, this happens because the planning board, the county planning agency, rejects something the town wants to do. In order for the town to proceed, they have to have a supermajority. They need 4 votes. That doesn't really change. And if the person walks out so they don't have a supermajority, then they don't have a supermajority.
What's the legal basis for requiring 4 votes?
It's established in the law. I mean, it's established in the law based on whatever's defined. There are circumstances defined when a supermajority is necessary.
What law?
Whichever law defines it. In the case of supermajority,
General municipal
it
law.
could be general municipal law, which the state defines that.
The legislature passed it.
Right, right. Yes.
Could you provide a few more examples of what would not be considered a prep board that's not foilable?
What's not foilable? It's difficult for me to do that because almost everything is. If it is think about this. If it's a record, if they have amassed something either electronically, digitally, a hard copy, it's a record. Okay, here's something that's not a record. There was a phone conversation. You can't say to them, I want a transcript of the phone conversation if they didn't create a transcript of the phone conversation. The phone conversation could have happened, and it could have gone on for 3 hours, but unless a transcript was made, there is no record. There is no record of that conversation. You can't compel them to tell you what happened in that conversation. And you can't compel them, by the way, to create a record. You can't say, I want a list of whatever, all of the telephone poles that have fallen over in the last 3 years. If they don't keep that kind of record, you can't compel them to create one.
What about the van conversation they had on the way to the gas drilling field? If they didn't take any minutes?
Well, you got a couple issues. You got to back up. If it was a meeting, they had a majority, and it should have been a meeting, they're supposed to take minutes, and you can file a complaint they didn't take minutes. But you're not going to have them create minutes out of the air. I mean, the record doesn't exist, you can't get it.
Right.
You can complain that it doesn't exist, but you can't make them do it. Yes, ma'am.
Delaware County, the next time that the Board of Supervisors get together, if I choose to be there, can I have the privileges withdrawn?
Sure. You can always ask for
And now,
permission.
on what basis would they refuse? Could they refuse?
Absolutely. Yes. Just because they're in a bad mood is good enough, unfortunately.
They never have it.
Right. Now, when we talk about the county, though, let me back up here, because I can't speak for Delaware County. I don't know what the charter is. I don't know how it's written. But a lot of counties have a provision that it only takes 2 members of the county board to move to allow privilege of the floor. So, and I can speak for Schoharie County because I know that and I spend a lot of time there. They don't like to give privilege of the floor. But if you get 2 friendly members of the board who know you want to speak, and you say, I'd like privilege of the floor, and the chair says, no, there's no privilege of the floor, they can say, I'd like him to speak. And another one can say, I'd like him to speak, and then you have privilege of the floor. I don't know whether that is the case in Delaware County, because I don't know the basis of that law, but I know it exists. I would investigate that. I would talk to your supervisor or a friendly supervisor and say, can you get me privilege of the floor? Because there may be a mechanism to get you privilege of the floor, even when the chair doesn't want you to have it. Yes?
I thought you said that they would have to have an established policy for privilege of the floor.
Yes.
And it should be written somewhere.
Yes. You can foil it. You can ask for it.
And then
Yes.
if you foil it and it's there, then why could they not grant?
Because they may say that routinely we're not going to have privilege of the floor unless certain criteria is met. We don't know. Whatever they say, it could be enough to restrict privilege of the floor.
But it cannot go against whatever their written policy is.
I wouldn't call it a policy. It's whatever decision they had made formally with a vote to establish the criteria. That's not really a policy. That could be as simple as a vote.
But it should be
Recorded,
documented
yes.
somewhere?
It should be recorded somewhere, yes.
Is finding out the details of this, where this stuff exists, is that a point of order that can be raised at the meeting, or is it something we have to go reading through, last 100 years of minutes?
I always suggest going for it. I mean, if you have something you want to know, I try to ask for it, really. I mean, you can always resort to FOIL. You can always fill out a thing and say, I want this information. But I think it's best to ask for it first. First of all, you give your elected or appointed officials the opportunity to be responsive, and in many cases they will be responsive. And that's only legitimate that you kind of give them that courtesy and you ask for it. If they absolutely blow you off, then I would say file a FOIL request and say you want it. The point of order, I mentioned point of order before. Point of order is a really funky thing. Nobody really knows what it is. I mean, everybody knows that it exists, and a lot of times, even if you have this really resistant elected body, town board, and you jump up and you say point of order, they're not really sure exactly how they're supposed to respond. So sometimes I say point of order, because maybe you'll get somebody's attention. You can't get it. You know? And really what it says is, point of order means that a process is not being followed. You know, whether the body has adopted Robert's Rules of Order or whatever they've adopted, technically, they're not following it. And you're saying point of order. They're supposed to stop and respond to the fact that there's a point of order. And most of them are unfamiliar with it in many cases. And half of the time, I don't know what I'm asking for, but I'll just jump up and say point of order because it gives me an opportunity to say something, and it's recorded in the minutes. So even if they say no privilege of the floor, I say point of order, and I spurt something out, and technically it's supposed to be in the minutes. So it's kind of a backdoor mechanism.
I use that point of order. I always say point of order, and I stand up and I'll ask a question, and it's always recognized. Always.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. Yes.
This is sort of an odd question, and I don't know if it's even something you can answer, but it's interesting. It's not in my town, we have our own weirdness. But a friend of mine in a neighboring town says there is an individual on her board who has not attended a board meeting in eons. How is this possible? Is that anybody have any thoughts or responses?
I think that's, again, outside the scope of this, but I think there's probably other areas that might be worth looking into. Your board, every board has an ethics code. I know. In some cases, it's one line, but there may be other ways to pursue that. But ultimately, what your mechanism there is the ballot box. I mean, if somebody is not representing their constituents, you got to vote them out. You got to find somebody else to run. Yes.
If they have a conference call, does that count as a meeting?
Yes, if it's a quorum, it does count.
So they should be taking minutes. Somebody should be taking minutes if they have a conference.
Well, they need to announce it so you can go and listen. Yeah. I'm not so sure you can compel them to be on the conference call, but you can compel them to allow you to be in the room. Yes, conference call counts.
Also, is the Committee on Open Government Robert Freeman's creation? If at some point he's going to retire, what will happen to the
Don't ever say that. I told him that he needs to live to be about 120. My biggest fear is that he will retire and they'll just let it fade away.
It's not mandated in the state.
It is mandated, but you know, how anything else, it can be eliminated. So he is a pretty incredible guy, I have to say that. He's a pretty amazing guy. So, yes, ma'am.
I'd like to talk about the Little League scenario that you had.
Yeah.
What we find happens, at least in our town, is that the elected officials, both village and town, are very well aware that if they do this in a group of three, that's a meeting. So what they do is, for instance, the town supervisor calls person X, member of the board, and they discuss something. And then he calls the next person, and they discuss something. There are never more than two of them.
Yeah.
But when the board meets, suddenly there's a consensus without a discussion of any kind whatsoever.
Happens a lot, yes.
Is there anything that can be done about it?
Probably not. No. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of business gets done. It's ethically questionable, but it's not illegal. It is. Let me just go to the back.
We have a real problem with accurate minutes in the Rose Room. And our town clerk has the supervisor check his minutes before they're published. And is it true that only another town board member can correct the minutes? As a public person?
You can, yes, only another town board member can make a motion to amend the minutes. But certainly as a member of the public, you can say, point of order, the minutes are inaccurate or under privilege of the floor. You can do that, and then hopefully you get a sympathetic board member to take the appropriate action. But you can't amend the minutes, and you can't make a motion to amend the minutes.
Our supervisor doesn't even, he makes the board accept the minutes, and then he tells them if you want to change something, put it in writing, but first it's already been accepted.
Well, he's making stuff up. So, all another board member needs to do is, I make a motion to amend the minutes. And there's nothing the supervisor can do to stop a motion. And then another board member says, I second that, and they have to vote. If there's a motion on the floor, they have to vote. And if the motion is to amend, the motion is to amend, whether the supervisor likes it or not. Yes?
What if elected officials get private citizens and public employees to form committees to discuss pieces of legislation? Are they supposed to behave as if they're a quorum and have minutes that we can then foil?
No. There's no obligation for advisory committees to follow those rules and regulations. There's kind of customary protocol in that they file minutes so they can inform the elected or appointed officials appropriately, but they're not obligated, no. They can have an advisory committee, you may have a comprehensive plan committee or you may have a zoning change committee. They don't even have to have open meetings.
It's a cute little loophole, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, because a lot of important stuff is going on in those meetings in many cases. So, in fact, the worst case scenario happens more than you would expect. I know a lot of towns who have advisory committees that don't want anybody in those meetings. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But ultimately, the checks and balances is supposed to be at some point their recommendations come back to the board. That's an open meeting and you get to make comments on them. And if, for instance, they're advising on the change in the zoning, there's going to be a public hearing at some point anyhow. So,
could you foil any emails that they had concerning the appointment of private citizens to these committees?
You can foil any email that was generated by or sent to an elected or appointed official. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And by the way, when you get into emails, because we're into new territory too, it's important to remember, if you get a response like, oh, we don't have them, I deleted them. Well, the next thing you want to foil for is, what is your retention policy? You don't want them to be making this up to evade the fact that they owe you an email. Hold their feet to the fire. Say, okay, what is your policy? Do you delete emails every 30 days? And there better be a policy, because they're supposed to have a policy that says this is how we handle emails. It's a record. It's an official record. You can't arbitrarily just dump them because you don't want to have them. Okay, that's evasive. Yes?
After a public hearing, is there any procedure that happens between the hearing and a vote that is taken by the board members? In other words, we just in Morris had a hearing on the road use ordinance. We went from a public hearing where all speakers were against it, and they took, as soon as we were done speaking, they immediately took a vote on it.
Right.
We've never heard any discussion between the board members about the ordinance, so any discussion had to have been held by telephone call or executive session or
again,
on
you
the
can't
golf course.
You can't force your officials to be diligent. I mean, you can only force them to have whatever discussion they're going to have, even if it's zero, in a public forum. But if they decide not to have discussion, there's nothing you can do about that.
And if they had discussed it at some other venue where we were not there, minutes should have been taken, but yet minutes are only records of motions made, etc. If they just had a discussion,
no,
it
the
wouldn't
minutes,
reflect it.
yes, if there was a discussion, the minutes should reflect the fact that there was a discussion. It doesn't have to report what everyone said, but it has to report that there was a discussion. Yes. Yes?
Getting back to Delaware County and boards of supervisors, which are 18 and 19, is there any way to make the supervisors give us a public meeting? Is there any, how many people, maybe 10 are the supervisors or 8, so that people have an opportunity to talk?
You have to get somebody friendly to make a motion for that meeting, and then a second, and then the majority vote. That's really the only way to do it. Yeah. There's no external mechanism to force them to have a meeting, for instance. There's no mechanism for you to do that.
It's just we've not had a public meeting in Delaware County, and it really is quite necessary.
Yeah. You have to get somebody to make that motion. Yeah. I mean, there's informal mechanisms to get petitions and all those, but none of those compel them to do it. It's persuasion, it's political more than it's procedural.
Start with one, and then get a second, and then a third, and then it's out to the vote.
Yeah.
If one makes a motion, and someone seconds it, doesn't it have to be voted on?
Yes.
So they can.
But you have to have your votes. I mean, otherwise you're going through an empty exercise, you know? If you only have 2 votes, okay, you can get a motion in a second, but you're not gonna go
You're
anywhere.
not gonna get the vote, you don't have that.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the question of the comprehensive committee. Like if the town board appoints a committee, you're saying that they don't have to give minutes to the board unless they decide that ahead of time and said, well, we're going to form this committee and we want minutes, and that you would say, well, where is it written? I mean, that's the way they would do it, but if they don't have that, you don't have to give them minutes? I mean,
Correct. An advisory committee like that is established based on the criteria that was voted on by the town board. And hopefully they're diligent enough to say, here's what we expect of you. This is your charge. That's how a committee is supposed to be defined. If they don't do that, and sometimes they don't do that, just say, okay, you guys get together and be a committee. Well, then the committee doesn't really have to do anything. They have no deliverable. But if they're told you must produce minutes, then sure, they're supposed to produce minutes.
okay, but if they're told, then they should.
Right, yes, right. But again, those are not minutes in the sense of an elected board. So even if they were told to produce minutes.
Of what's going on in their meetings and what's going on every time they meet.
Right. Until they give those minutes to the town board, they're probably not a record you can foil. Because they're not obligated as a voluntary committee to produce these records under FOIL. So it gets a little touchy. Until they're in the possession of an official body, they're not really a record you can foil.
You said that we then would ask them, what is their policy for eliminating emails? If they get back to you when they say, well, we emailed this person and asked them to be on the committee, maybe, but we lost it. Oh, what's your policy every 30 days? There's something out of Chicago, there's a group out of Chicago called eDiscovery. They're former FBI agents, and they can get you metadata. They can tell you how to go to court and request the metadata. So even if they're clever and they say, oh, 30 days, it's gone, all is not lost. At what point could towns like this come together and maybe get the Attorney General's office to get the back channel, instead of maybe a phone call, maybe they're using email to pre-decide these things after the public hearing? It seems like there's a pattern throughout the region.
Well, you're really asking a number of questions, and it's important to understand, first of all, you're absolutely right. When anybody deletes email, chances are it's not really deleted, you can't get it. But in terms of things like e-discovery, which is an actual thing that happens as part of litigation, there has to be litigation. You can't just say, I want your deleted emails, because you have no standing to do that. I mean, if you sue the town and as part of the lawsuit during discovery, you say, I want your emails, including your deleted emails, or more easily, the emails that were backed up on backup media, you could do that. But there has to be a lawsuit involved. You can't just do this routine.
I guess that's my question. I mean, at what point do we get an Attorney General to look at what's been going on regionally around here with all these meetings?
You get it the day you can convince the Attorney General it's worth the person looking at it. I've sat in Attorney General's offices more than once, and it's a tough sell. Really, they want the smoking gun. They really do. I'm not saying you can't interest in AG.
It's a matter of numbers.
I'm sorry?
It's a matter of numbers. If they get enough complaints about some particular thing, I don't know what their standards are, but if you have enough of them, they will take action.
Yeah.
But it has to be a lot of complaints.
I had an Attorney General, I related this story just recently. The subject came up about conflicts of interest in public officials, and it's very upsetting to people when they perceive a conflict of interest. But the distinction in New York between a conflict of interest that you perceive and one that's legally a conflict of interest is an enormous void, right? So I had an Attorney General actually tell me, kind of off the record, show me the video of the bag of money being exchanged. Short of that, I can't help you, because the law doesn't have teeth in it in terms of that stuff. You have to show a direct connection between somebody benefiting financially and an official act that they did. It can't be that they might make some money down the road. It can't be that it looks bad. I mean, that's an appearance of impropriety, maybe you can get somewhere with that. But in terms of conflict of interest, unless it's direct and tangible, you can't go anywhere with it, so. Yes.
What sort of muscle does Robert Freeman have? I mean, is it just, you said he would send them a paper, a piece of paper. I mean, what's the effect of it?
He doesn't have enforcement authority. He doesn't. But he has a tradition of being extremely well respected. His opinions are written, they're really unchallengeable. He has such a good understanding of law. So if Robert Freeman says you violated the Open Meetings Law or Freedom of Information Law, everyone pretty much accepts you did. Then the next question is, how much do you want to push that? What are you willing to do? A lot of elected and appointed officials will say, okay, I stand corrected. I'm not going to do that. Now, under the Freedom of Information Law, if a town does something and in the process is violating one of those laws, you can then petition through certain legal processes to have that overturned. So you can actually use that as leverage to say, I'm sorry, you've got to go back and do this again. That doesn't count. So you do have some recourse. But it's not a direct link. It's not like Robert Freeman gives you the piece of paper and they go, whoops, sorry, okay, we're repealing that law. It's no longer in effect. You really got to work at it. But he gives you the ammunition to do that. Yes?
In our town, the highway committee, which advises the highway department, is the town board. They claim because no actions are taken, same thing with executive sessions. They claim because no action is taken within those meetings, that they don't have to have a record of those meetings.
Okay, a couple things. You're right. If they go into executive session and they take no action, they don't have to record it, okay?
Okay, but what they do is they then go back into regular session
And take action.
And take action, yeah.
They can do that. But the other interesting scenario is, you're saying that the committee is made up of
the town board members.
Right. In that case, they're incorrect in that they don't have to have a record. If they're acting as the advisory committee, they're still the elected officials. They still, if there's a quorum, it's a meeting, so they have to take minutes. The minutes are supposed to be accurate. Doesn't matter what hat they put on. They are who they are, which is elected officials. Yes?
On the town board, before the official meeting starts at 7 o'clock, you can get there early from 6:30 to 7, and they call it an informal discussion.
Yeah.
Now, is it they don't take minutes,
right,
but the townspeople can discuss whatever they want with them, and they're pretty nice about listening and having a discussion. Now, since they're all there, and it's your meeting, so
Yeah,
is it official or is it
that's
not?
That's a gray area. I mean, if they're individually sitting there and they're talking to you individually and they're not interacting as a board, they might be able to get away with it. But the minute they act as a board, so, you say something to a town board member, hey, what do you think about that road condition up on the hill? And the other town board member pipes in and there's a dialogue, I would say you could argue that that's a meeting. Yeah. I mean, that's a meeting. But if they're using the opportunity for you to individually have counseling sessions with your board members, they could probably get away with that, I would say. But again, I'm not an attorney. I mean, that one's a fine line. I would say you really need to have to explore that one. You can simply relate that to Robert Freeman and say, I'd like an advisory opinion. What do you think? He'd respond to you. Yes. Yes.
When we write letters to our town board or we provide them with information, if we request that they're made part of the public record, do they have to do that?
Yes. In fact, I always tell people if you're going to send correspondence, say, please accept formal correspondence to the town board. So you're actually telling them this is not just some casual thing. I want this to be recorded as correspondence.
And then when people, would that be part of the minutes for that particular meeting that other people could have access to?
Yes.
All of that material?
Yes. Yes. Other people can foil your correspondence, by the way. And you know, you can foil somebody's foil, which is really gets kind of crazy. You know, I've seen this happen where people are in a dispute with somebody and they foil documents that are held by an elected official, and the elected official gets mad and foils your foil, and this goes on and on and on. But if it's a record, everybody has a right to foil it. It doesn't matter if you're an elected official, you're still a citizen, so you can file a foil. So you can foil a foil, and foil a foil's a foil response, if you want.
But just to clarify that though, if you send a correspondence to the board, it's usually like listed in correspondence.
In correspondence,
and
in the minutes.
The supervisor doesn't read all of the letters that have come in as correspondence. He just says, you got this letter from this person, this letter from that person.
Right.
And then if individual board members want to bring it up, I mean, sometimes I'll see a letter and I'll say, oh, well, this letter says blah, blah, blah. But it's not that the minutes have to
they don't contain the letter.
Contain the contents of the letter, just that there was a letter.
But the letter has to be retained and recorded along with the minutes, which means it's then subject to FOIA.
Yes.
So if you see in the correspondence, there was correspondence from Mary Smith, you FOIL the letter from Mary Smith. And that's how you get to it. Yes. In the back.
I have been in the private sector, and I have been in executive session. And I know there's a difference between public and private, and when we went into executive session, all we discussed was where we were going for dinner that night. So it can be very ludicrous as to why they're calling executive session.
Yes. And again, like I mentioned before, often it's hover. They may say, you know, we're going to go in to discuss whatever, and then they get in there and they talk about something that comes up. You know, and it may not be even a deliberate attempt to kind of, you know, delude you, it just comes up. But they're supposed to say, oh, okay, this is outside the scope of the executive session, let's go back into the meeting. Yes.
Yeah, actually, what I'm wondering about now is something, our right to know. Let's say, Barbara knows that in her town they did meet with a pipeline company. We don't know. In a board meeting, can we ask to be told? Did you meet, at least 3 of you, with a pipeline company?
Right.
Can we ask that?
Sure.
And are they obliged to answer us?
No. No. You have a right to ask, but they're not obliged. You're never obliged to answer your question, but you have a right to ask it. And then you can follow it up with a FOIL request if there was any records produced. But look, I mean, you got to be realistic. If someone was trying to covertly meet, they're not going to take minutes. I mean, you know, so there's nothing that you can really get. In that case, you know, you're trusting the integrity of the people you elect.
But they can't keep information from us. If they really were a quorum, they can't tell us that they wasn't a quorum.
I mean, there's no reason why they can't be misleading, but the real question is, if they were actually doing that, how can you find out? You know, that's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes question. I don't know. There's nothing that makes them be honest and straightforward.
Suppose one board member will say, oh yeah, we met with the people and we met on this and this date, and then he says, I'm not allowed to talk about it. By whose authority is he not allowed to talk about it?
That sounds like it's political authority. I mean, it sounds like he's being
It's like the head of the Delaware Board of Supervisors, that they're afraid of him and they're not allowed to talk about it.
Sometimes the only recourse you have on these things is a political. I mean, if you know you're being misled, you know they're careful enough not to produce records you can get under FOIL, your only recourse is to get other people in that position. And that's not easy. It's not easy.
And just tell them, listen, I think they can have a job next time around, so.
Sometimes that works. Yes.
I thought no votes could be taken in executive session. That they could go into executive session, but that the vote, in order to be a recorded vote, they had to come back out of the executive session, make the motion for whatever it was, and do that in the public meeting. Is that not right?
That's not right. They can vote in executive session if the vote has to do with the thing that they went into executive session about. Right. So in other words, it's a confidential thing. It falls into that category of things that can be protected by executive session. Then they have a right to go so far as to make decisions about that. But it has to be.
Report the decisions in open meeting after?
They have to take minutes of any decision made in executive session, and those minutes are foilable. So more than likely you could find out generally what the decision was, but without knowing those details that they went in there to protect to begin with. Okay. Yes?
So in our town, they always say they're going into executive session to talk about personnel matters. They always say that. Did I understand properly that they have to tell us which personnel, which person they're talking about?
No, short of identifying the individual.
Oh.
But they have to say, this is a personnel issue dealing with potential discipline of a member of the town highway department. I mean, they have to be that specific. So, again, they say we're going into executive session for personnel issues. Point of order, can you please clarify what personnel issue? How about one more question?
Would some of this, in larger markets, you've got cable access video broadcasting from the time the lights go on to the time the lights go out, whenever there's a public meeting in a public place. Is some of this, would this be a good thing if we could get people to maybe use a smartphone and their broadcast capacity to just start getting these people used to being covered?
Yeah, it's, again, that's a mechanism you have as a citizen to record a meeting. And if you think it's appropriate, particularly if you think that it'd be helpful to kind of remind them what they're doing, you have every right to do that. I can't say whether it's going to be effective in your particular case or whether it be counterproductive. I don't know, but you certainly have a right to make that decision.
That's where you can use social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., etc. That's within our rights to be able to use that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they're really acting unreasonably, it sometimes can be very powerful for that to be repeated on YouTube. It's something to consider. But on the other hand, if you have a functioning board who's trying to do the best they can, and in rural areas, they're volunteers, and frankly, they mess up, and it's, sometimes it's counterproductive. If you want to throw somebody on YouTube because they made a procedural error, I'm not so sure that's always going to be helpful. Because you're just going to get people angry at you. So I think you really need to make that decision carefully. How about one more? Go ahead.
Our supervisor tends to think that he knows the law, he can make it up as he goes on. So for example, if we open the door for the privilege of the floor, or we have the 3 board members say, we need to have an agenda, we'll just say, no, we don't. What is the next step that we need to do?
Well, if you had 3 board members vote for an agenda and the supervisor refused,
Yes.
I would think that those 3 board members would take it on themselves to make sure the agenda was produced. They would do it themselves. And if they were diligent board members, they should publicly make a statement. Hey, the supervisor is ignoring the will of the board and the will of the people, ultimately. If I was them, I'd put it on the record. So they're also applying political pressure as well. They can't have him arrested, but they can certainly make it obvious that he's ignoring the will of the board in a legitimate vote, sure. And again, boards have ethics rules, and there may be some recourse in there.
But same with opening the door for the privilege of the floor. I can see his also making it very difficult. So is that a case where the board members could also say, excuse me, yes, you do have to do that?
Right. If the supervisor can be overruled, he's just one vote. That's it. So you just need to get the votes. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.